Students, welcome back. Today we will discuss about development policy making and the roles of market, state, and the civil society. Okay, you can find these topics in chapter 11 in your textbook. Let's begin. So first of all, let's ask a question of balance. So you know that for the economy to work, we need all of the stakeholders to work and take their roles. And then the question that we need to ask is regarding the roles and the limitation, of course. So roles and limitation of the state, market, and the citizen sector or NGOs in achieving economic development and poverty reduction. We have to define the roles and the limitation of each of the stakeholders, which are the state or the government, the market, and the citizen sector or the NGO. So NGOs is like LSM, you know, in Bahasa. So they also have important role in achieving economic development and poverty reduction. We will discuss each of their role in this chapter. And then the next is the development planning, concepts and rationale. So there is something called the planning mistake. Basically, in the past, few doubt the importance and usefulness of national economic plans. It's not new, right? Because when we have a national-wide economic plans, some people will definitely have some doubt about it, and it's okay, you know, because sometimes we need critiques to develop really good and evidence-based national economic plans. Recently, however, disillusionment has set in. But a comprehensive development policy framework can play an important role in accelerating growth and reducing poverty. So when we work together, you know, not only the government have a plans, but also there is feedback from the citizen, feedback from the NGOs, then that way we can have a comprehensive development policy. And it can play an important role in accelerating growth and reducing poverty. Okay? And then the nature of development planning, resource mobilization for public investment. So this is like the normative or the concept of development planning. So ideally we would want the development planning to result in the mobilization, resource mobilization for public investment. So all of the resource that we have, it's going to be used for the public investment so that everyone in the country can enjoy it, not just some groups or those who have resource or those who are rich, but everyone in the economy. So the goal is for economic policy to control private economic activity according to social objective formulated by the government. So that's one of the concepts of development planning. Of course, it has its own advantage and disadvantage. I think you can discuss about it a lot. And then the next one is planning in mixed developing economies. And then the next one is private sector in mixed economies comprise. This is where we will take the role of the private sector in the development planning, and we can consider a few sectors in the economy, like for example the subsistence sector, the small scale business, the medium-sized enterprise, large domestic firm, and then large joint or foreign owned enterprise. And we will focus on how all of this sector here they take action or they have role in terms of development and poverty reduction. Okay, and then the next one is the rationale for development planning. So this is like the positivist approach. Of course, we will face market failure, and then there will be not ideal, I mean there will be advantage and disadvantage when we talk about the resource mobilization and allocation. We will face a lot of different different opinion on this one, especially if we live in a country which is very diverse. There will be a lot of debate in here. And then the attitudinal or psychological impact, and then the requirement to receive foreign aid. Foreign aid is also an interesting topic when we talk about development planning. I think in the next chapter we will talk more about the foreign aid. Okay. So there are three general forms of market failure. The first one is market. Wait a minute. The first one is market cannot function properly or no market exists. Yep, sometimes you will find that market, actually not sometimes, I think all the time market cannot function properly because we have market failure. Or sometimes you will find a phenomena where no market exists. For example, if you are in a very extremely poor area, the market doesn't even exist, so that you have to think how to make people's life better. And then the next one, the market exists but implies inefficient resource allocation. Inefficient resource allocation is an example of market failure. And then more expansively, the market produces undesirable result as measured by social objective other than the allocation of the resource. So oftentimes, such as more equal income distribution, often items such as more equal income distribution and merit goods such as health are treated as separate rationales for the policy outside economic efficiency. So that is correct. Sometimes economic policy, they want to make the market efficient, but they miscalculate the equal income distribution and also merit goods such as health, so that the market now has undesirable result as measured by social objective. Okay. And then these are some market failures. Market failures can occur when social costs or benefit differ from private costs or benefits of firms or consumers. I think we have talked about this before. So when the social cost is not equal to the private cost, then there will be deadweight loss in there, and sometimes the deadweight loss can have a disadvantage to the people, or in this case that's an example of market failure. And then another example of market failure is market power, such as the monopolistic or monopsonistic. So monopolistic when you only have one single seller, meanwhile monopsonistic is when you only have one single buyer. Okay, and then the next one, market failures could occur in the context of public goods. We have free riders for the public goods, so free riders cannot be excluded except possibly at high cost. So you already know what free riders is. They are who take advantage of public goods, but they do not want to pay the amount required to fund the public goods. Okay. And then we also have externalities. This is like, for example, when a firm, they polluted the water source or the river or something, that's an example of externalities. So agents do not have to pay all costs of their activity or are unable to receive all the benefits. And then we have the prisoner's dilemmas occur when the agents better off if others cooperate, but individual agents better off defecting. And then we also have coordination failures can occur when coordination is costly. Please refer to Big Push in chapter 4 if you want to find an example for the coordination failure. And then the last one, maybe not the last one, but the last one in this context is the capital markets are particularly prone to failure. That is correct, because in capital market, the resource allocation is usually not very fair because it's going to be biased towards those who own a lot of resource. That way, those who are very rich, they can have big power in the capital markets. Okay, and then next, the market and government failures. This is broader arguments. So government can have failures, definitely. So this is the government failure. In many cases, politicians and bureaucrats can be considered utility maximizers, not public interest maximizers. So that is correct. That's why you witness corruption. It's because the government or the politician and bureaucrats, in this case, they are maximizing their own utility instead of the public interest. Okay. So can jump to conclusion. If economic theory says policy can fix market failures, that will do so in practice. Yeah, that is correct. So sometimes we hear that because the market fails, we need government. But one thing we should consider is that government can fail too. So it's not necessarily solving the market failure when we have government. We also need to make sure that the government is not doing something it's not supposed to, like for example, for example, maximize their own individual utility. Okay, and the analysis of incentive for government failures guides reform. Yep, we need reform to overcome the government failure. For example, the civil service reform or the constitution design. Developing countries tend to have both high market failure and high government failures. Okay, so that's one of the characteristics of development countries. They will have high market failures and high government failure. And then the next one, the development planning process. These are some basic models. The characteristic of the planning process. Usually we will have planning in stage. This is for the basic models. The first stage is going to be aggregate growth models, and then multi-sector input-output, social accounting, and CGE models. Three stages of planning, so aggregate, sectoral, and then project. Okay. So this is the aggregate growth models. The projecting. In the aggregate growth model, we will projecting macro variables. So we have KT equals CYT here, where KT is the capital stock at time T and YT is the output at time T. C is the average and marginal capital output ratio. Okay. And then now when we introduce investment, then this is what we get. So we have IT equals to KT plus 1 subtract by KT plus delta KT equals to SY equals to ST, where IT here is the gross investment at time. So we know from the previous lecture, right, that investment equals to saving. This is where we're going to relearn about it. And then S, the small s here, this is the small s here, is the saving rate. And the big S here, or capital S, this is the capital S, is the national savings. And the delta here is the depreciation rate. So why do we have the depreciation rate? Because the capital, especially physical capital, they will definitely have a depreciation rate. Okay, like for example, if you have machine, then you can use that machine maybe until 10 years, and then it will from that time you buy the machine until 10 years, the function is going to decrease, right? So that's the depreciation rate until in the 10th year the machine is going to break down. So like the living cycle of the machine. And then the G here, so you have G is the targeted rate of output growth. The G here, that's the targeted rate of output growth. Now you have G equals to Y times T plus 1 subtract by YT divided by YT, which is delta YT divided by YT. Y here is the GDP or the output. Let me write this down for you. This is like GDP or output. Okay, and then now let's transform the formula. Now we have delta K divided by K equals C delta K divided by K equals K divided by Y times delta Y divided by K equals delta Y divided by Y. So if you want to transform this targeted rate of output growth in terms of K, this is what you get. Okay. Now if you transform that into G here, then you will have SY, so the saving rate times Y, subtract by delta K divided by K equals saving rate divided by C. C here is the average and marginal capital output ratio. Okay, and then you have S divided by C, subtract by delta. So now we will have N plus P equals to S divided by C subtract by delta, where N here is the labor force growth rate and P is the growth rate of labor productivity. Okay, so that's the basic models of development planning process. So this is the aggregate growth models. We have mentioned in the previous lecture that one of the most important key for growth is the productivity. So that's why now we define the aggregate growth models as the labor force growth rate and their productivity, because it's not going to result in a high growth when we have a lot of labor but the productivity is low. So productivity is very important. Okay, and then now we will talk about wage. Now we have W plus pi equals Y, where W and pi are wage and profit incomes. So Y is wage, pi is profit. Okay, let's transform the equation. Now we have S pi times pi plus SY times Y equals to I, where S pi and SY are the marginal propensity to save from wage income and profit. Okay, so the proportion of wage that they're going to save and the proportion of profit that they're going to save, that equals to investment, because that's the money that they don't spend on consumption, right? So it's going to the saving, and we know that saving equals to investment. Okay, now we will have C times G plus delta equals to S pi subtract by SW times pi divided by Y equals SY. Sorry, plus SY. I mean SW. Sorry, I misspoke. Okay, so that's the aggregate growth model. And now we have multi-sector models and sectoral projections. So we will discuss about the inter-industry or input-output models. I think you will learn about this more in your international economics, because you will definitely talk about social accounting metrics and then input-output table and even CGE. Okay, we will have some a short introduction about it in this course. Okay, so this model can be extended in two ways. The first one is the SAM model, where SAM is the social accounting metrics, where the data from national accounts, BOP, balance of payment, and flow of funds database is supplemented with household survey data. And then we also have a CGE models, where the utility and production function are estimated and impact of policies are simulated. So with the SAM, basically you will calculate the data from national account, BOP, and then flow of funds, and combine it with the household survey data. So you will have huge metrics called social accounting metrics. But with the CGE model, this is where you're going to have a huge database about production function and utility, and then now you will introduce policy. So you will kind of simulate what's going to happen to the utility and production function if you introduce some policies. Like for example, what's going to happen if you raise tax, or what's going to happen if you lower the interest rate. So that's basically you can check that using CGE model. Okay. And then we have, so this was the multi-sector model or sectoral projection. Now we will have the project appraisal and social cost benefit analysis. So the basic concept and the methodology, first is specify objective function and then compute social measure with shadow price and then establish decision criterion. Okay. Okay, and then you might have question about computing shadow price and social discount rates. So basically you calculating the social rate of discount or social time preference. Okay, and then regarding the project appraisal and SCB or social cost benefit analysis, we will introduce NPV or net present value. Well, the NPV is calculated by sigma times BT subtract by C divided by 1 plus R to the power of T, where B is the expected benefit at time T and C is the expected cost at time T and R is the social rate of discount. So when you use this approach, project appraisal, it's like you are evaluating a project. So what's your project? You're going to evaluate it. What's the impact of the project? And you are going to use the NPV to evaluate the project. Okay. So you have to choose the project and then have some decision criteria. For example, you want to use the NPV rule, and then you can compare the internal rate of return with an interest rate, for example. And then you can take the conclusion based on your calculation or measurement, and whether the planning models and plan being consistent or not. So like for example, if you have a target, the NPV must be this high or this low, it's whatever you want, and then you will evaluate whether that happened or not. Okay. And then this is okay. I think this is a study case in the 1980s, the policy shift towards free markets. This is a study case that you can read in your textbook. It tells a history about how the policy since the 1980s shift towards the free markets. And then these are the government failure and the preference for markets over planning. So like I mentioned before, after the 80s, we tend to shift the development policy to lean towards the free market instead of the government, because we have witnessed government failure. Okay, so the argument for that is problems of plan implementation and plan failure. So with the government development planning, we have witnessed plan failure. So and there are a lot of problems. So that's why we shift to the free market, letting the market correct itself. And then the theory versus practice. So the theory is saying that development planning by the government is good, but the practice doesn't show similar. And then the next one is the deficiencies in plans and their implementation. Again, the implementation is not as expected, and then it's not efficient either, and then insufficient or unreliable data. So there is not much evidence or data that show that government development planning really works. And then the next one is unanticipated economic disturbance, external and internal, and then institutional weakness. lack of political will, and then conflict, post-conflict, and fragile states. So basically, because of this government failure now, the development policy kind of shift towards the free market. Okay. And then these are the potential problems of government intervention in developing countries. The first one is individuals know more about their preference. Yep, sometimes when you have policy or rules or regulation, for example, it's not always the case that the policy or the regulation actually reflects the people's preference. So that's why a lot of policy fails because they don't know individual preference. And then the government may increase risk by pointing all in same direction. This is a problem with the general rules, because every area, every village, every city, their preference might be different. So we cannot just have one policy for all, you know what I mean? It cannot be uniformly distributed policy for everyone. And then the government may be more rigid and inflexible in the decision making. Yep, that's true. And the government lacks of capabilities to administer detailed plans. That is true. Sometimes when the government have policy and then the policy needs to be implemented in the village level, for example, that's a very small scope. Sometimes it's not very practical. So that's why when it's come to village, very small village or very remote village, for example, usually what works is the local NGOs, because the local NGOs, they actually know what the people need, what their preference are, so it tends to work better than the general government policy. Okay. And then the next one is the bureaucratic obstacles. Yep, that I don't need to explain more about it, it's obvious. And then hard to replicate market incentive system within governments. And then different parts of government may be poorly coordinated, and then black markets place constraints on government, and then controls create incentive for rent seeking, and then planning may be manipulated by narrow privileged groups. So those are the potential problems of government intervention in developing countries. And then the next one is the market economy. Well, ideally, okay, this is just for the ideal condition, okay? So ideally, well-functioned market economy requires clear property rights, law and courts, freedom to establish business, stable currency, public supervision of natural monopolies, provision of adequate information, autonomous states, public management and externality, stable monetary and fiscal policy instruments, safety nets, and encouragement of innovation. Theoretically, this is a very well-functioning market economies, but it doesn't always happen in real life, do they? So this is the ideal scenario. Oh, and then this is some example of case study regarding the market economy. Please read that in your book. We have the Washington Consensus on the role of the state in development and its limitation. And then the consensus reflected a free market approach to development espoused by IMF, the World Bank, and the US government agency. So if you want to read it, that's fine. But the main idea is that the US, they use the free market approach to development. Does it work? You tell me. You tell me, how is it in the US right now? Do you think it works? Do you think it doesn't work? You can discuss about it. Oh, apparently they list the Washington Consensus here. I think you can read it by yourself, but there are a lot of elements that they talk about here, like fiscal discipline, tax reform, trade liberalization, and others. And you can see how that works in South Korea and then Taiwan. Okay. And then the Washington Consensus on the role of the state in development and its subsequent evolution. So there has been a lot of debate regarding a new consensus where they are going to have new emphasis on government's responsibility towards poverty alleviation and inclusive growth and the provision of fundamental public goods, importance of health and education, recognition that markets can fail, and then the governments can help secure conditions for an effective market-based economy. So this is the new idea for the new consensus, okay? And then the next one, development, political economy, theories of policy formulation and reform. So we will talk about some political economy in here. So in order to achieve the development in the context of political economy, we must ensure that we have understanding voting patterns and on policy reforms, and then institution and path dependency, and then we also need to talk about the democracy versus autocracy, which facilitates faster growth, and then the roles of the NGOs in development and the broader citizen sector. So this is the the global trends in the governance. We have democracy, anocracies, and autocracies here. You can see that the democracy is quite popular from time to time. It's going up, and then the anocracies is not very popular, and then autocracies has fall. So definitely, the data shows that democracy is still very much popular around the world. Okay, does it work though? That's for you to discuss. And then the next one is the development roles of NGO and the broader citizen sector. So NGO is very important, like I mentioned before. Sometimes the NGO, they can have better relationship with people, and they can reach very small scope of area that the government cannot. And sometimes the NGO can actually assist the government so that their policy can be applicable for the remote area, or like, for example, the native people, or things like that. So the NGOs are potentially have important roles in common property resource management, local public goods, economic and productive ideas, and also possibly other activities that are either excludable but not rival, rival but not excludable, partly excludable and partly excludable, and partly rival. Okay. By the way, there are a lot of examples for all of this part here, all of this activity in here. You can read it in your textbook. And then this is the typology of goods. You have, so the x-axis here is rivalry. So the farther to the right, it's the more rivalry. And then the y-axis here is the excludability. The higher it is, the more excludable. You have public goods in here where it's not rivalry, it's non-excludable. And then you have common pool goods here when it is rivalry but non-excludable. And then you have local public goods and productive ideas where it is non-rivalry but excludable. And then you also have private goods. You have private goods when it is both rivalry and excludable. Okay. And then there are other potential comparative advantage of NGOs. The first one is innovative design and implementation, and then program flexibility, specialized technical knowledge, provision of targeted local public goods, common property resource management, trust and credibility, representation and advocacy. So basically, when you have a lot of NGO, how can you tell which one is better than the other? So you look for this characteristic. if they have this characteristic, then they are probably good NGO. That's it. And then these are the limitations of NGO. The first one is sometimes it could be insignificant, or they have very small scale and reach, and then they may be lacking necessary. So and then, well, they maybe have problem with exclusionary, elitist, or even ineffective, and then lacking of adequate incentive to ensure effectiveness, and then captured by goals of funders rather than intended of beneficiaries. So that is true. You know, when you work, wherever you work, including when you work in NGO, you will want to have some resource, you know, to pay salary, to have profit. It's not wrong, but sometimes when you work in NGO and your main goal is the money, not the beneficiaries, like not the people well-being, then that's where you get lost. You know, NGO can have money, NGO can get rich and have profit, but they cannot forget about their main beneficiaries, which is the well-being of the people. And then they could giving too little attention to means preventing needed scale, or they can find that means such as fundraising can become ends in themselves, and then lacking immediate feedback. This is something like quality control. So sometimes you don't have good quality control in NGOs because they're not firms, you know. When you are a firm, then you have very specific goal, you have very strict monitoring and evaluation policy, but in NGO it's not always like that. Okay, funny story, I have worked on an NGO for like 3 years, I guess, when I graduated from my undergraduate program, and yep, it's not wrong that we experience all of this problem in here, but it doesn't mean that there is no merit from an NGO, because we also have some of these characteristics. But these problems, you know, they are real. They are very real. Okay, and then the next one, trends in governance and reform. I think we have talked about trend in governance before in this figure, so let's talk about it. So if we want to have a government that actually works, then we need to tackling the problem of corruption, abuse of public trust for private gain, and then good governance enhance capability to function, and the effects of corruption fall disproportionately on the poor. So when you have a corruption, you know who's going to have the worst effect. That's the poor people, you know. And the good governance is broader than simply an absence of corruption. That is very correct. So good government is not just simply a government that is not corrupt. No, it's much more than that. And then, one of the way to tackling the problem of corruption is to have a decentralization, because when the power is centralized in the central government, then they will have too much power. Just like when you have a monopoly, right? They will be very powerful, so you have to decentralize or have a decentralization. Okay, the development participation, alternate interpretation. Sometimes with the decentralization, you will also have the role of NGO. Okay, this figure show the corruption as regressive tax, the case of Ecuador. Okay, so basically the x-axis is the firm size, and then the y-axis is the percentage of bribe cost as share of firm's revenue. So when you are micro firms, you can see that the bribe costs 8% of your revenue. Meanwhile, if you are a large firm, your bribe only costs about less than 2% of your firm's revenue. Same thing happened in the household. This is the household status. So if you are from the low-income household, then the bribe costs almost 5% of the household income. That's so bad. If you are rich, then the bribe only costs about 2% of your household income. So this is why when there is corruption, the victim, the real victim, is the poor people. Okay. So this is the association between rule of law and per capita income. So the x-axis is the rule of law index, and the y-axis is the PPP GDP per capita. So the better law you have, it seems like the higher the per capita income. Okay, so I guess that's it, the material for this chapter. You can read a lot of study case in your textbook, and I'll see you in the next chapter.